I was brought up in the era of Jimi Hendrix and bands like The Who, Pete Townsend, who could jump around and play the guitar behind his back. Like a lot of my friends that I knew growing up, we had this kind of romantic notion that if we just fiddled around long enough on the guitar, we'd be able to play. I mean, not that I ever thought I'd be like Jimi Hendrix, but, we kind of thought that, gee, if they could play the guitar behind their back or with their teeth like that, certainly sitting normal or standing up, we'd be able to get to a place where we could at least play basic chords and strum in time and have a good time. I'm sure most of you who are watching this video have come to the realization that it's not that easy, especially when it comes to learning things like bar chords. I had a student send me a message asking me if my fingers were somehow exceptionally long because I was doing a lesson on bar chords and I was demonstrating. Just for the record, my fingers are not exceptionally long. They're probably about average, and I'm not exceptionally talented. But I have learned over the years a system that I use to learn new things, and I apply it to guitar and it really works. It's not something new. In fact, I think it's what most piano teachers have been teaching their students for years. But somehow as guitar players, I thought anyway, we were beyond the normal rules of learning music. In any case, I've organized it into a clear system that I think you'll find incredibly valuable, especially for learning bar chords. Now, I'll go through the system first. This is kind of the theoretical part. And then we'll do the practical approach. I'll apply it specifically to learning bar chords. I've divided my system into 5 steps. The first step is to overview. The second step is to break it down. The third step is to practice what you've broken it down to, or what I call increments. The fourth step is to combine 2 or more of the increments. And the final step is to assess where you are and then start over. Now let's go over the steps in a little more detail. The overview, step number 1. You want to take a look and see, where can I break this down into logical parts? How can I break this skill down into pieces and then combine them back later? Or what is the smallest part that I can break down? You also want to think about, what are the more important parts? Here we want to think about what's called the 80-20 rule, or the Pareto principle. The idea is that there's 20% of something that will get you 80% of the results. So we want to look for where you can get the most bang for your buck. Step number 2, break it down. You want to break it down to the minimum smallest part that still makes sense and that you can feel a sense of accomplishment within a reasonable period of time. Step number 3 is to practice that part. Now, you're not going for mastery on this one little increment, we'll call them. What you're going for is something sufficient to feel a sense of success. Another way I teach students is to think about 80% of on the way to mastery. Think about getting it to just about 80% of where you think it should be. Now, when you practice, you always want to start slow and then pick up little by little. A mistake us adults often make is to try and go too fast and stop and start and end up ruining the rhythm or just getting frustrated. So go slow, get it right, and then pick it up little by little. Step number 4 is to combine and integrate. What that means is to take a couple of the parts and put them together and see how they fit. So for an example, if you were learning a piece of sheet music, you might practice this measure and then the next measure. When you got those both pretty good, then you put them together and see if you can go from one to the other. You do that until you get to a whole phrase. And then you practice one phrase and combine it with another phrase, and so on. With a skill like playing bar chords, you want to break down into parts of playing a bar chord and then put those parts back together. And finally, step number 5 is to assess where you're at. Take a look and see, is this the best place to put your time and energy? Have you made enough progress? Let's take a look now again and see what's the next increment that you should be working on. This entire process is a cycle. What you're doing is you get started, you go around the cycle, then you go back from assess to overview and start some more increments. You see, you don't know what you don't know. So you can't wait until you know exactly what you need to work on to get to where you want to go. You get started, you get more information by going through the cycle, and then you know what else you need to work on, and you start again. Let's put this into practice. We're going to apply it directly to learning bar chords. So playing bar chords involves making a bar and then some fingering. We're going to start with the most basic part of making a bar chord. So first of all, probably the most useful bar chord in the beginning would be the F chord. I'm going to reduce that name a little bit. I'm going to call that a major chord with the root in the 6th string, or a 6th string root major chord. The reason I do that is because once I learn a 6-string root major chord, I can apply it all up and down the neck. So just say it's an F chord kind of is limiting. And the 6th string has the name of the chord. That's what the 6-string root means. So yeah, that's an F note, the first fret on the 6th string. So one increment of making a 6-string root major chord would be that bar itself. And that usually is a big stumbling block for people. So you might want to work on just the bar by itself. And there's a number of different exercises. I can put something in the description field. So a next increment might be the actual form of the chord without the bar. Really, this F chord is nothing but an E chord moved up 1 fret. And the E chord without the first finger, because you need that for the bar. So you might want to practice that, an exercise that uses this form. So let's say you practice those 2 increments and you're feeling fairly confident. Now we might want to put them together. We'll make that major chord form and then make the bar with it. Once you get to that point, I'd probably use an increment that I often use with learning chords, which is to just go through forming the chord without strumming and then taking a hand off. You see, that's 2 different skills, making the chord and then strumming so it sounds good. By just making the fingering, you get a chance to practice the fingering separate from just how good all the notes sound. Because once you strum, you're going to hear the buzzing and everything. So I'd have students maybe do that just a dozen or so times a day. And I'd spread this out. Trying to do it all in one day is probably not realistic. I'd spread it out over a series of days, maybe even a week or so, of just practicing each of the increments and then little by little adding them together. The next increment might be to actually strum the chord as you form the chord form, and then take your hand off. Just get used to making the chord and strumming it. If it doesn't sound right, take a few seconds to adjust it, but don't spend too long on it. This is another principle that really has worked for me and for my students, to keep coming back at something in little short bursts, not to try to bear through something for a long period of time. In this case, make the chord, strum it, let's say it sounds a little like this, make some adjustments, see if it gets a little better, take your hand off, shake it off, put it back on. Then after a few days of that, I think you're ready for an exercise that actually moves the chord around. Once you've gotten the major chord to where you can move around the neck, it might be time to add another form of the bar chord, and so on, step by step. Now, a couple things to keep in mind. First of all, that everyone at some point along the process will get demotivated, will feel lost the momentum. This is normal and happens to everyone. I try to address that by thinking about it ahead of time and coming up with some strategies. There's a lot of different things you could do, and there's not time on this video to go into it. But, for an example, I often make a strategy when I'm learning something new that's difficult. After breaking it down, I'll make a calendar and say for 7 days, I'm just going to practice this part. And then I put an X for each day. So regardless of how good I do it, I just want to get that X. That helps motivate me. I don't know if that would work for you. And there are lots of other strategies that we could talk about later or that you might even be able to share in the comments. Another thing I want to mention is that when students feel frustrated or confused, they think something's wrong. Maybe something's wrong with them, or more likely the teacher. But I want to tell you that that is normal and it's always going to happen, but it's not a bad thing. This actually is what provides the fuel for overcoming difficulties. Confusion and frustration is your friend. I would encourage you not to dwell on it, but use that as a signal to either go back and break it down to smaller pieces, or use it as an energy and motivation to just work through a particular difficulty. And finally, don't be afraid to keep going back around the cycle. This is not something where you just go around and you get it and you're done. Occasionally that happens. But most of the time, you'll go around, figure out what you still need to work on, and then go back around the cycle and keep doing that. Again, this will help you get through any difficulties with frustration or confusion as you keep going back and assessing where you're at and what you need to work on next. Thank you for joining me today. Hey, I'm considering making a course on bar chords that would be available to the public. If you're at all interested, help me out. I've created a little survey and I'll put a link in the description. It's very short and it'll let me know what your difficulties are and how I can best help you. And you'll have the option to be contacted when I complete the course, but only if you choose that particular selection. Take a minute now and go ahead and complete that survey. I appreciate it. I'll see you in another lesson.